Okay, so we're diving into Act 4, Scene 1 of Romeo and Juliet. And, sometimes it feels like Shakespeare's just piling on the misfortune, right?
Oh, absolutely.
This is one of those scenes. Every character is walking into a minefield, totally blind to the danger.
Yeah.
We've got Romeo, banished, Juliet heartbroken, and her parents cluelessly pushing her to marry Paris.
It's a recipe for disaster. And Shakespeare uses dramatic irony so well here.
It really is. The scene opens with Paris at Friar Lawrence's cell, finalizing those wedding plans.
Right.
He's so excited, bubbling over with anticipation, completely oblivious to Juliet's true feelings.
It's almost painful to watch.
For a student, it's like watching a train wreck in slow motion.
You want to shout, "Don't you see what's happening?" But of course he can't. He's caught up in his own little world.
Exactly. Blinded by this desire to marry Juliet.
Yeah.
And then Juliet enters. Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place.
Oh, for sure.
She has to face the man she's supposed to marry, knowing her heart belongs to someone else. This is where Juliet's intelligence really shines through.
Absolutely. She can't openly defy her father or reveal the marriage. So she uses language to kind of deflect.
Like when Paris says, "Happily met, my lady and my wife." And Juliet responds, "That may be, sir, when I may be a wife."
That wordplay.
Just
But
like
for
that.
students, that's classic Shakespeare. What's unsaid is just as important as what is said.
So true. And it highlights those power dynamics. Juliet, despite being so young, is skillfully navigating this incredibly dangerous situation.
I mean, you have to admire her quick thinking under such pressure.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, a really important illustration of how societal expectations limited women's choices back then. Juliet's trapped in a system that gives her very little agency. She's forced to be creative to find a way out.
Absolutely.
It's interesting, though, even though she's being so careful with her words, we also see these little cracks in her facade. Her desperation is
Yeah.
starting to show.
Right. There's a real urgency in her language now.
Like when she tells Paris, "I will confess to you that I love him." She's talking about Romeo, of course. But Paris thinks she's talking about him. It's heartbreaking to see her struggling to keep up this charade while her world's falling apart.
Yeah. It raises the stakes. For the audience, we know she's desperate. We know time is running out. It's almost unbearable.
And then we have poor Friar Lawrence stuck in the middle.
Oh, yeah. Talk about a tough spot.
He's the only one who knows the truth about the marriage.
Right.
And now he's being asked to officiate another wedding for Juliet. It's
Yeah.
an impossible situation.
It really is. You can see him wrestling with his conscience.
There's that moment, remember, where he says to himself, I knew not why it should be slowed. He's talking about the wedding,
Right.
but it feels like he's talking about everything,
Yeah.
wishing he could slow things down. But events are spiraling out of control.
That's Shakespeare using those asides so effectively.
Yes, giving us insight into his thoughts.
Yeah.
We see that internal conflict. He wants to help Romeo and Juliet, but he's also terrified of being discovered. And for a student reading this, I think it's a chance to consider those different motivations, right? Friar Lawrence isn't just a plot device. He's a complex character with real moral dilemmas.
Right. And it raises some really interesting questions for discussion, too. About right and wrong, about loyalty, about what happens when we interfere with fate.
Exactly. And then we get to this incredibly raw moment where Juliet just lays bare her despair. She makes it crystal clear to Friar Lawrence she'd rather face death than marry Paris.
And the language here is so powerful.
It is. It's disturbing.
She talks about being chained with bears, shut up with dead bodies, even buried alive.
These images, they're not just dramatic, they're a window into Juliet's mind.
Definitely.
For a younger reader, I think they can be really unsettling, maybe even frightening. But it forces us to confront her desperation, the impossible situation she's facing.
Shakespeare doesn't shy away from those dark emotions.
No, he doesn't. And this scene really reminds us of the consequences of all this hate, the lengths people will go to escape unbearable circumstances.
And it's in that moment of utter despair, that Friar Lawrence steps in with his plan.
Oh, that plan.
A plan that is, well, a little bit out there.
To put it mildly,
Oh.
it's risky, it's complicated, and it relies on a lot of things going right.
Oh, wow.
That's where we're going to leave things for now. So Friar Lawrence is proposing this wild plan, and for a student, it's like, wait, is this really happening?
It really pushes the limits.
It does. It's almost hard to believe, even for Shakespeare.
But that's what keeps us hooked, I think. He's taking this huge gamble, and we're left wondering, will it work?
And for a student, maybe in junior high or high school, it's a good chance to really think about Friar Lawrence. What's motivating him? Is he really doing what's best for Juliet, or is there something else going on?
That's the question, isn't it? On the one hand, he seems compassionate. He wants to help her escape this marriage.
Right.
But you could also say he's trying to fix a problem he created by marrying them in the first place.
It's like he's trying to outsmart fate, which, with Shakespeare, rarely ends well.
Never a good idea.
And that brings us to, one of those big themes, fate versus free will. Do we control our destiny, or is it all predetermined? Juliet deciding to take the potion is a pretty powerful statement, I think.
It is. She's trying to take control of her life.
Exactly. And the way Shakespeare describes the potion, it's almost like foreshadowing,
Oh, definitely.
Friar Lawrence goes into all this detail about its effects. How she'll appear dead. Cold veins, no breath, the color drained from her face.
It's like a mini death scene.
Right. And you can't help but see it as a hint of what's to come.
Yeah. And it ties into that idea of appearance versus reality, a theme we see throughout the play.
Things are not always what they seem. Deception can have serious consequences.
Absolutely.
And, this whole plan, it depends on so many things going exactly right. Friar Lawrence needs to reach Romeo, Romeo has to get the message, and then he has to get back to Verona before Juliet wakes up.
It's a lot to keep track of. A student might even want to, make a list of all the steps involved and think about what could go wrong.
It really is like a domino effect.
It is. If one piece falls out of place, the whole thing crumbles.
And it brings us back to fate again. Is it coincidence? Or is something else guiding these events towards this tragic end?
A question that's haunted readers for centuries.
For sure. And every reader has to answer it for themselves, I think.
I think so too. But what's so interesting is, even though we can sense the tragedy coming, we still hope for a happy ending, We want to believe Romeo and Juliet will find a way.
It speaks to Shakespeare's genius, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Creating characters we care about so much.
It really does, even when we know what's going to happen.
We're rooting for them, even as he shows us those cracks, those forces working against them.
Absolutely. And that's such a good lesson, Especially for younger readers. Life is complicated. And even the greatest love stories can end in tragedy.
Yeah. So as we move to the last part of our deep dive, I want you to keep those themes in mind. Fate, free will, appearance, reality, the consequences of acting impulsively.
Right. And remember, we might be talking about a play written hundreds of years ago, but these themes, love, loss, family, fate, they're just as relevant today.
Absolutely. Romeo and Juliet, it's not just a love story. It's about what it means to be human, our flaws, our passions, and that capacity for both incredible love and incredible sorrow. We've been talking about Friar Lawrence and this big plan of his to reunite Romeo and Juliet, and it really makes you wonder, is this guy a genius or just crazy?
It's a good question, Does he really think this through, or is he just acting impulsively? One thing students might want to pay attention to is how Friar Lawrence talks about his plan.
Interesting.
Does he ever seem unsure, or like he regrets his decision?
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
Because you're right. We need to look beyond the surface. Think about a character's motivations. Don't just take them at face value.
Exactly. I mean, on the one hand, Friar Lawrence wants to be seen as this, reasonable, faithful guy, a peacemaker.
Right.
But his actions here, they suggest he's willing to, bend the rules a bit.
Even deceive.
To get what he wants.
And that brings us to this question. Is Friar Lawrence ultimately a good guy or a bad guy in this play? Does he help Romeo and Juliet, or does he lead to their downfall?
It's something worth debating, for sure. Without him, would Romeo and Juliet have even gotten married in the first place?
True.
But then again, maybe his plan, even if he means well, is what ultimately leads to their deaths.
Yeah, and it's not just about Friar Lawrence either. Juliet's taking a huge risk herself, faking her own death, trusting that everything will go according to plan.
It's an act of incredible courage,
It is.
but maybe also a little naive.
That's what makes Juliet such an interesting character, I think, especially for young readers. She's stuck between childhood and adulthood. She has these powerful emotions, but doesn't always understand the consequences.
And that's something we can all relate to, I think. Wanting to take control of our lives, but not always knowing the best way to go about it.
Absolutely. It's what makes this play, even after all these years, so powerful, so timeless. It's about love, loss, family. It's about trying to find your place in the world.
Exactly. And as you continue reading or watching the play, keep those questions in mind. What clues does Shakespeare give us? What choices do the characters make? Don't be afraid to draw your own conclusions about who's responsible for what happens. or if anyone is really to blame at all.
Because that's what great literature does, right? It makes you think. It challenges your assumptions. And it starts conversations that last long after you finish reading.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
So we've come to the end of our deep dive into Act 4, Scene 1 of Romeo and Juliet. We've seen the drama unfold. We've unpacked the language. And we've looked at those complex themes.
And it's just the beginning.
It is. There's more to come. More twists and turns, heartbreak, hope. And in the end, that tragic ending that continues to affect audiences even now, all these centuries later.
So keep thinking about these ideas as you read on. And remember, the most important insights often come from the questions we ask, not necessarily the answers we find.
And that's a thought to leave you with. Until next time, keep exploring the world of Romeo and Juliet. And keep asking those tough questions.